Cool, awesome. Well, welcome everyone. Thanks for coming. Today we're going to talk about who's protecting the devices. We're going to share some of the lessons we learned during COVID-19 around the distribution of responsibility for securing medical devices. Before we jump right into it, let me introduce myself. My name is Chad Holmes. I've had a bit of an interesting career up to this point. I started by making things. I was a software developer for a while. Found a bunch of security issues in the government systems I was working on. Didn't like how they were being handled, so I jumped into the world of security. And I started focusing on breaking things. I started teaching people not only how to break them, but how to fix them. So I was always on the good side, not the bad side. And so my goals today are to do the same with you, to inform you about the IoT security challenges we're seeing in healthcare, teach you how to reduce the risk as quickly as possible. Of course, answer any questions you may have. So ask questions as we go through. I'll answer them. I'll also answer some at the end. And then finally, provide additional resources as we go through. Come on in, guys. More the merrier. So as I go through, feel free to ask questions. I'll answer them as we go. Feel free to save them until the end if you like to. A little bit about Cynerio. So Cynerio was founded with a very simple goal, a simple to understand one, a very hard to execute one. We want to secure every IoT, OT, and medical device within healthcare environments. We want to make sure those devices that are providing critical care are also not an entryway for things like ransomware attacks. We were founded in 2017 with that goal. 2020 was an incredibly exciting year for us. We were named a Forrester Wave leader. We were also named a Gartner Cool vendor during that time. And on the back of that, we've been rapidly expanding from the few dozen hospitals we have throughout North America to hundreds and hopefully thousands worldwide. Right? We know we need to secure those devices. We want to be the ones that do that for you. So before we jump right in, any idea what this 580% stat is? Any guesses? That's all right. So 580%, that's the increase in ransomware attacks on healthcare facilities in the second half of 2020. So we've seen a six-fold increase in that time, which is incredibly scary. We continue to see dozens and dozens of attacks happen every single month. So with that in mind, I'll talk a little bit about today's agenda, then we'll talk about the actual presentation. I'm going to start with some vocabulary around IoT and healthcare. So if you know all about IoT, feel free to kind of just bear with me for 2 minutes. If this is new to you, that's okay. A lot of people don't understand the full vocab around it, so I'm going to spend a couple minutes explaining it. We're then going to discuss briefly the risks and reward around these devices and if it's worth the balance of these. We'll talk about why the risk landscape is what it is and what we can do to possibly change that. And then we'll get to the really interesting part about who's in charge, right? When we're talking about Biomed, IT, security, et cetera, who's in charge of actually securing these devices and making sure that they're as locked down as possible. We'll then talk about extending IT practices. A lot of people think IT have this magic checkbox that can just say secure all the IoT devices as well, or the Biomed devices as well. That's certainly not the case. I will do an incredibly quick one-slide scenario pitch so you know exactly what we do and how we can help you. And then I'll do a much more interesting demo showing how we can take Biomed team members and make them much more invested in the security process and work better with the others in your organization. And of course, we'll wrap up with some Q&A. So a little bit of vocabulary to start off, and let's talk about the world of Internet of Things in healthcare. So the first one I'd like to talk about is IOMT, or medical IoT, or They love us already. All right, yeah. There we go. Okay. So it's been a great presentation already. So we're Internet of Medical Things. Think of this as all those devices providing healthcare that happen to be connected to a network. So these can be things like IV pumps, CT machines, anything that is helping patients in some way that also has a connectivity angle to it. That's considered an Internet of Medical Thing. IOMT devices sit under the broader umbrella of IoT, Internet of Things. So these are anything in a healthcare facility, whether they're medical or otherwise, that are connected. So these can be things like security cameras and door locks. So while they might not be giving critical care in any way, they exist in the greater facility and therefore, one, help with care in some indirect way, but also may introduce risk into the environment as well. A cousin or sister technology of IoT and IOMT is OT, or operations technology. So a lot of people think of hospitals in terms of, hey, we're providing care, but in reality, they're big buildings, big facilities that happen to have care being provided in them. So if you think of things like HVAC systems or electrical grids or elevators that are connected so they can be better monitored, repaired, whatever the case may be, those are operations technology that if they go out, if they're attacked, if they're taken down, will take the whole hospital down with them, right? If you don't have elevators working, if you can't keep the temperature in a certain range, you're not going to be able to provide good care. And then finally, we have the term connected devices. And I like to put it up here because I hear people calling things connected quite a bit. Specifically, connected devices are actually incredibly simple devices that usually have one function and a really simple interface. So think of like a smart light bulb switch. You turn it on or off on your phone and that's kind of it. That's what a connected device is. A lot of times this term is used for the broad scope of things. For today, I'm probably going to stick with IoT. So if I say IoT, I mean all these devices. I also mean all those Biomed devices you all work with every day, right? The devices that are providing the patient care that you're familiar with. I'm going to call them IoT. If anyone has any confusion about what's what in here, I'll be happy to answer it as we go through. Sound good? Work? Okay. So a little bit of the rewards and risks of IoT. So the very first thing is connecting these devices is incredibly beneficial. They wouldn't be connected if there weren't some benefit. Across the board, they provide more. I call this one of the more categories. They provide more care. They make it easier to provide the care. That care is often faster. It's often more accessible. Effectively, that flow of information coming from these devices providing care gives the patients a better experience. It allows them to heal quicker or feel less pain or whatever the case may be. But there is absolutely a trade-off here. Because of that connectivity, we see a lot of risks that pop up. These are devices that are connected to patients. So if you have an IV drip that's providing care, and that's hacked, so it's not giving enough medicine or too much medicine, that can cause a really bad situation. So there is risk there. They frequently require updates. Updating devices can be a long and tedious process, both from the practitioner side to who's actually physically altering the device in some way or changing the software or firmware, but also from the manufacturer side, where patching the patch process may take quite a while. These devices are absolutely vulnerable to attack, and we'll see this as we go through. I really, really wish we could have a setting that says this is a medical device, make it super secure and just have it be. Unfortunately, it's not the case. They are still just devices manufactured by manufacturers who often grab a lot of different technology and cram it into one functional package. Just because it's medical doesn't mean it's any more secure. And then more importantly, and kind of to the point of this talk, is who actually owns and is responsible for the security components of these devices. I've talked to a lot of people this week and I got a lot of great insight. And I've heard that there's a pretty common pattern of we get direction from the IT team, we get a ticket, it says do this, it better be fixed soon, let us know when it is. Is the IT team responsible there? Is the Biomed team responsible? It kind of sits in a gray area. So we're trying to figure out exactly how to make that relationship as productive as possible. At the end of the day, the rewards, the value that these devices provide are far, far greater than the risk, right? They're in environments, they're making people have better lives at the end of the day. But we can't discount the risks either. We have to acknowledge that the risks are there. They're now accounting for a significant amount of the ransomware attacks in healthcare environments. We have to start finding a way to secure them much more quickly than we already have. And as you might guess, Cynerio, of course, we can help with that. So a little bit about the risk landscape. There's a couple reasons why these devices are so risky and why healthcare is under such attack. The first thing we know is there are at least 5 million different devices that are operational in the United States today that are touching patients on a daily basis that have critical level vulnerabilities. These are known to have issues, but they're providing care and people are just accepting of that because they can't discard them, they can't throw them away, they're not at the end of their life cycle. They just have to accept the risk because they are providing care. So we first have an environment where there's a lot of entry points for attackers. We also know that this environment and the data that it processes is incredibly valuable. It used to be that EPHI records were considered to be about 3 times as more valuable than other types of records, credit cards, for example. The reality is we're starting to see more and more studies come out saying they're 20 times more valuable. You can buy credit card records for about 10 to 15 bucks a record online. EPHI records are now going for $250 to $500 per record. The reason being, there's a significant a significantly greater amount of data in those EPHI records, and it's data that cannot be changed. For a credit card, you're probably going to know my credit card number, my expiration date, my name, and my current address. For my EPHI records, you're going to know my name, my current address, maybe my social security, a lot of my treatment history, all that information for my mother, all that information for my father, maybe for my siblings, and a lot more. There's a lot more valuable information that also cannot be changed, which is why EPHI is so valuable. So now we have an environment that has a lot of devices with risks. The data that it processes is way more valuable. And then finally, hospitals and healthcare facilities, unfortunately, just are not at the forefront of cybersecurity. And I'd argue that we don't necessarily want them to be. We want them to be secure, but when they have an extra $100,000 to deal with, more often than not, we want that spent on healthcare and providing care instead of being the most secure fortress in the world. I'm not saying they shouldn't be secure. I think they need to be more secure, but ultimately we want healthcare facilities providing care at the end of the day. So right now, 3 out of 4 healthcare facilities are not monitoring traffic in any way. Most attacks don't happen over a matter of hours and days. They happen over a matter of months and quarters. On average, it's about 9 months. So we now know that there's 5 million critical devices at least. The value is in the data they hold in most cases. And if they're being attacked, 3 out of 4 hospitals will never ever know until they actually execute the full attack, which is absolutely terrifying. And the reason for this is that healthcare in itself, because of its core goal of providing care rather than making money, makes it a vulnerable environment. When care is the priority, when you're not able to have outages, right? At worst, you can divert care to another hospital. You can't turn people away unless they have someplace to go. And with an industry that favors, the spend favors patience rather than security, it's a perfect combination for easier attacks. This is complicated by regulatory requirements. When there's a breach of more than 500 records, it's mandatory to be posted in a public HHS website as well as other places. The intention there is to actually inform people if they've been involved in some kind of breach. It's a good intention. What that actually leads to is a great source of data for hackers who are understanding who's getting attacked, how many records are being attacked, who may or may not be paying ransom. So it's accidental data leaks that are actually fueling more attacks than pulling back. The technical result out of all of this is slower security adoption, because that spend is going to healthcare rather than security in a lot of cases. A greater attack surface, like we just talked about, a lot of vulnerable devices that are easy to attack with valuable information, and an over-reliance on cybersecurity insurance. Cybersecurity insurance and attacks pays for about 5 to 6% of the overall attack cost. If you look at Scripps in Southern California recently, they've had over $100 million in costs related to a ransomware attack back in May. The cybersecurity insurance covered $5 to $6 million of that. A tiny, tiny drop in the overall bucket. So now we have this industry that's focused on care. They don't have great cybersecurity practices. Their reports are fueling the fire for attackers. And then if an attack actually happens, they're getting conflicting guidance. The FBI is telling them don't pay ransom because we don't want to encourage ransomware attacks. But then they're seeing that recovery costs are 30 to 50 times what the actual ransom would cost. The ransom is typically in the $500,000 range. Recovery can cost 60 to 100 million in a lot of cases. And if they do recover, there's no silver bullet. We're seeing a lot of repeat attacks. We're seeing a lot of cases where attackers have gone in, exploited one attack, and then have found other ways to exploit it once there's a recovery in place, which again, absolutely terrifying. So the industry in itself, at the root of providing care for people and focusing money on care, which is exactly where we want it to be focused, has become a vulnerable industry because of that. And we're also seeing shifting patterns. It used to be that phishing was far and away the best way to attack people for ransomware attacks and other types. This Ponemon report came out last month. I wish we had sponsored it instead of Sensinet because it is an outstanding report. But effectively what it said was it went and it looked at all ransomware breaches during the pandemic. And it found that while phishing was still 21%, about a fifth of all these attacks, the cause of the attacks, IoT and medical devices were equivalent. They were also 21%. Up until this, people thought that was here and there, maybe 3 or 4%. It's a full fifth to a quarter of the actual attacks are coming through devices where there's actually limited security practices around them. And so when we ask people, we ask customers, you know, take all your efforts around phishing, your education, your spend, the time you spend on that. Is that anywhere near the effort you're putting into device security? And the answer is almost always no. This is just, if there's one thing you take out of this, other than we can help you and you should contact us after, it's that the shifting landscape of how people are attacking and getting into hospitals is going to where there's the least defenses, as you might expect. And that's at the device security side. So the reason you're really here is who's in charge of IoT security, right? This is a Biomed conference. Biomed folks are here to make sure you have the life cycle of the device down, that it's providing care, that it's not introducing risk. You're not necessarily going to be security experts, nor are we asking you to be security experts. What we are asking you to do is understand who's working with who in an environment and give you the information to start working with the IT team, who aren't always the most friendly people, to say it that way, yeah, who aren't always the most friendly people, who when they identify things might just open a ticket and send it to you over email and say, hey, get this fixed as soon as possible. Let's start talking about how to work with them. And one way we can do that is start to understand what they're trying to do. So first we have the security folks, usually a subset of the IT team, excuse me, or maybe partners with them in some way. When you think of the security folks, they're a little more blunt than normal. I'm a security weenie myself, so you know it well. They're there to manage real-time risk. They're there to identify issues that they might have coming up or have already been exploited in some way. And they're always trying to just protect you as well as they can. And everything is always on fire in their minds, right? So when you're working with them, just know that everything's always on fire and they're just trying to put out fires over and over. The IT side down here, they're trying to build up bigger programs. They're trying to make sure that when they get a patch, say from a vendor, that you're being notified in a way that you can roll it out as quickly as possible. They often don't know much about the devices you're working with. They might just know that we have 1,000 IV pumps where there's a known critical vulnerability on top of the one that we found 3 months ago, right? We need to patch these again. Why is it so hard to patch IV pumps? They probably don't fully understand the complexity of taking an IV pump out of circulation, shutting it down, installing the patch, starting it back up, testing the patch, making sure it's okay, and putting it back in circulation, then doing that 1,000 times over, and then doing it again 3 months later when a new patch comes out. It can be incredibly complex. Informing them about some of those challenges can be really helpful. We have the Biomed folks. You're all familiar with Biomed, so I'm not going to spend too much time on that, but you're just trying to make sure those devices stay safe and functional. We also have network folks. So a lot of times we'll see Biomed and network folks fall into the same bucket because they have IT and security folks telling them, you've got to secure all this stuff. You've got to do X and Y and Z, but they may not always get the right direction or the right insight to do it. So we see Biomed and network folks, while you may never actually work together or work together rarely, you have the same goal, which is to secure these devices in your own special way. You guys might be patching devices. The network people might be splitting them into microsegments, for example. And I'm going to show you some examples as we go through to show how you might work with them. And so whenever I show this slide, I always get the follow-up question, yeah, that's great, but really who's in charge? Right? I just said a whole lot of stuff without telling you any of the real answers. And it comes down to every organization is different, but there's 3 different levels that we see. If they can work together productively, we can actually start to see really good progress. And the 3 categories we have to consider are availability, access and influence, and capability. Capability I'll start with because that's everyone in this room. You all have the capability to make changes on devices. Network people have the capability to make changes at the network level. That said, you're not security experts. Not all of you are security experts. Some actually have quite a bit of knowledge. You need to be told what to do, why to do it, and how to continue to do it over time. So while you have the capability to make these changes, you need solid direction and insight from others to make them and know when and how to make them. So if we go back up to the top here, we have availability. Ultimately, if someone in the executive suite, whether it be a CIO, a CTO, whoever else, doesn't make team members available and say, we can either change their focus, we can hire more team members, we can bring in contractors, whatever the case may be. If they don't make team members available to do that, it's going to be a really, really big struggle. Because at the end of the day, you have time where you have to have time to do this stuff. So if we can get some kind of leadership buy-in that these are efforts worth making, I think ransomware has more than helped us provide the fuel for that. We then have to go to IT and security and say, all right, you all know how to run projects really well. You have a decent idea of what we're dealing with in terms of inventory and assets, the overall layout of the hospital. It's probably not perfect, but you have a decent overall view. But we have the actual capability to start making those changes. How can we work together to do that? And that's where you see this executive coming in and help. IT and security, make sure this gets done. Make sure you're working productively with these folks. Biomed and network folks, make sure you're actually getting the information you need to update the systems and then update them in a timely manner. Is this accurate or am I way off based on your experience? Okay, yeah. All right, cool. Call me out, please, because I've talked to a lot of you and I've heard some really interesting stories about, again, IT just sending tickets. I've also heard really interesting approaches to ransomware. It's been a 50-50 split this week of people that just said, we need to get back up and running. We'll pay ransomware. Every one of them had a really good experience with ransomware folks, which I thought was funny. It was almost like the ransomware folks were post-paid consultants. They came in, they hacked their system, and then they told them how to fix it after. The other half went ahead and restored at a much higher cost. So it's kind of interesting to see different mindsets around that. So getting back to this. In a lot of cases, people assume that the IT team knows everything about Biomed and IoT devices. Okay, they just don't, right? IT and IoT, completely different technologies. IT is very often focused on workstations and servers and things like that. That is incredibly different than the medical devices you all work with every single day. And so while the conceptual practices, I'm sorry, the screen's a little bit blurry, the projector's not great. The actual concepts behind these around asset management and creating policy and things like that, those concepts are the same. But the actual execution of them does not extend, seamlessly into IoT. You have to take a different approach because they're incredibly different technologies. And so that's what we're trying to do, is trying to help IT teams understand that, and you all can help inform them of that as well. And so I'm going to do a real quick overview of how we help. Hopefully this kind of clears up what we do exactly. I'm going to start showing a couple specific things you can do and some questions you can ask right after this. So the first way that we help, and this is a really cool one, we launched it last week, so I want to brag about this one first. We have this really cool feature now called attack detection and response. Remember how I talked about most attacks sit there for about 9 months before they pull the trigger, encrypt everything, demand ransom and everything? A lot of those attacks actually have pretty identifiable calling cards, right? They're hitting the same servers, they have the same communication patterns, they have, if it's malware, it's trying to replicate, so it's dragging down network efficiency, things like that. Because most hospitals don't monitor their networks, it can just bounce around in there until they decide to pull the trigger. So we created this really cool service called Detection Response, ADR, where we go in, we sit in your network in a passive way, so it's not interfering with your network in any way. We can go much deeper into that if anyone wants to, but we identify the malware identifiers and say, hey, it looks like you have an attack here, or there's some really suspicious behavior here. Let's go ahead and take a look at it. And the IT question there is always, well, we have all those services in place already. They have them for Windows servers, right? They don't have them for Biomed devices. So we launched this last week. We're incredibly excited about it. We've had a lot of interest in it already. Our more traditional approach is around risk reduction. And there are these things in networking, and we're a networking company, so I'm going to go into the geeky world of networking just really briefly, called segmentation. Effectively think of a network as a big place where all these devices, the thousands of medical devices you have, are talking back and forth to each other. If you properly segment them out, put them in their own houses, they can only talk to the devices they need to talk to. So the radiology machines should probably be talking to each other, but they probably don't need to talk to the cardiology machines. And if you can segment them down, if radiology gets attacked in that case, it may go down for a day or two while you recover it, but it's not going to take down cardiology or any of the other departments. So what we do is we help people identify what those segments are. We do it in an automated way, so much more efficiently than humans typically can. We also test it, meaning if we're undergoing a project with the network team like this, we can test it before they roll it out, so they don't roll out policies and take down all your devices by mistake. You would think testing that stuff would be a pretty standard thing, but testing tens of thousands of policies can be quite difficult. So that's kind of our traditional service. We also have service hardening. So if we see outgoing traffic and it's hitting Russian malware servers, or more likely, people are holiday shopping off, again, radiology machines or x-ray machines, if they are browsing social media on devices they shouldn't. We see this all the time. Heck, if they're using Nintendos and it's interfering with the network, or they're putting the Tesla on the network, we're going to identify that. We're going to make sure the services that they're using to contact the outside world will not interfere with the network, lower down that risk as well. And then finally, one that hits a little closer to home with y'all, vendor access control. How many of you have vendors that have a direct link, a secure link in some way into your devices to secure their devices? How much effort do you think they took to make sure that those are the most protected connections ever? More often than not, they're saying, hey, let's give ourselves ample permissions to make sure we can do our job. And they may not go down and tweak the little settings that maybe are a little over generous to them. We don't want their hack to become your hack. We want them to continue to monitor what they're doing. We want them to continue to maintain the devices as they're supposed to do. But we want to make sure that if they have a breach on their end, it's not getting into your end. So we have vendor access controls. Any questions before I show these in practice? It's much easier to show than to talk about them. All right. So I'm going to go through 4 use cases here. I'm going to jump back and forth in the slide because my memory is awful. We're going to start with going in and finding all the devices that have default credentials on them, right? Because if we have default credentials on thousands of devices and an attacker gets in, it's really, really easy to look those up. Next, we're going to go in and we're going to pretend like you are meeting with the IT team soon. And while you might not know anything about networking, you can say, hey, we have some things you might want to look at the network level. Don't fully understand them, but here's where the resources would be for you to fix them. We're going to jump back to Biomed a little bit after that, and we're going to go and look for all the devices in your environment that have a recall on them. Just, hey, what do I have for recalls? Where do I need to, next time I'm talking with GE or BD or whoever, make sure that they're giving us the recall information we need. And then finally, I'm going to show off that ADR technology I was just talking about in our sandbox environment here, see where there may be active attacks going on. Of course, if you want to look at anything else, let me know as we go through. So let me go to a different window here. There we go. Cool. Again, sorry, it's really blurry. I promise it's much sharper in real life. So this is the Cynerio dashboard. Yeah, if you want to think about what this is showing, imagine if we went and put what we call a collector on your network. It's not interfering with your network at all. It's collecting traffic. It's saying, oh, that looks like EPHI. Let's ignore that completely, get rid of it. We don't want to look at EPHI, but we do want to look at things like serial numbers, firmware versions, device versions. We have about 150 different identifiers we use for every device that you have out there. We collect all this information. We then go cross-reference it with all the information we have to make sure that if you have a specific device that has a recall or has a known vulnerability, we're going to start reporting that to you. So what we have up here are the baseline scores for this fake hospital environment. We have the benchmark of all our customers. They should have a risk score of about 83.5. This environment is great for demo purposes because it has a risk score of 48.2, which means I have all kinds of cool vulnerabilities to show to y'all. We also break it down into medical and non-medical devices. You guys are going to be a lot more interested in medical devices versus the OT side of things that may be more interested in non-medical. You'll see a lot of universal power supplies, for example. I don't think you guys care at all about UPS compared to some of the CT machines we're going to look at. So we also break things down into patient safety, confidentiality, and disruption. I'm going to go ahead and look at the highest risk patient safety issues. You can't see that, but there's 1,000 of these that we're going to go ahead and look at. So I'm just going to drill into these. I'll log back in. We'll let this load up real quick. And so these are the assets with the highest risk. Sorry, let me get back on the right screen. Do that again. Demos always go right? There you go. So here's a list of all the assets. You can see it's not really sorted in any order right now. I can slice and dice as I want, but there's IV pumps listed there. There's medicine dispensers. What else do we have in here that's good? There's a CR machine here. Lots of different devices. There's 1,000 devices in total that we're going to want to look at. But what we want to do is find all the devices that have default credentials that we want to change. That's an easy change that you guys can probably make pretty easily if you have the time available to do it. So I'm going to go up here, take a look at the specific risks. We'll let this load up real quick. There we go. And I'm going to break it down into the risk group of default passwords. What you can see is there's 39 devices here, some CT machines, some power slides, more CT machines that we've actually identified have default usernames and passwords on them. So we can drill down into any one of these. We'll look at the CT machine, and we can see that this is going to give us details about the CT machine, the name, the model, the manufacturer, when it was first seen, when it was last seen. So you can see if it was taken offline, if it bounces on and offline. It's going to give the IP address, the location. We have a lot of people we've talked to this week that have said, hey, it's great to have an asset inventory, but we can't tell where the assets actually are. Because we came at this from a risk-first approach rather than just an inventory approach, we can collect not only the risks, but the inventory, and then connect with your hardware in place, your networking information, to identify pretty closely where they actually are within your environment, which is incredibly valuable. Then we have all this added benefit of risk, which is what we actually focus on. But we can see up here that there's a privileged default password, I promise that's what that says, around telnet port 23. Now, you all may or may not telnet in to the machines, but next time that you're talking with GE, and you have kind of your monthly call, whatever it may be, you can say, looks like we have a dozen of these CT machines. We have a wide open telnet port with default credentials that if an attacker can get in our environment, they can take over these machines. Can you please change that? And GE technicians can probably do that in an hour or two. They can get to those, they probably have that secure link in, they can change it. That's an easy discussion for you guys to have, right? This is the information you need to do that. And we could scroll through and we can see there are other things like this one has an end-of-life OS. You might want to talk to them about upgrading the operating system or figuring out how we can patch it in the future if it is end-of-life. You can see that this has default FTP credentials in place as well, so they may want to change that as well. But it's incredibly powerful, one, when you're just trying to secure your systems, and two, when you're renegotiating those contracts and you want a little bit of leverage and a little bit more work that they need to do to provide a more secure environment, this information can be incredibly valuable. Make sense so far? Cool. All right, I'm going to jump to the networking side now, so that next time you're talking with the IT team, you can actually say, look, it looks like we have some things where we could get some quick security wins. I don't really know what mitigation is. I'm sorry, I don't really know what segmentation is, excuse me, but I was told you might be able to do something with it, so here you go. So again, I'm going to go in, I'm going to take a look at the highest critical stuff. I'm just doing this to get a short list of really impactful things. You can see a lot more information. And rather than look at the risk here, I'm going to look at mitigations. And we'll give the mitigations just a second to load. And what this is going to load up is, one, it's going to give us a network map we can look at. So you can go to your network team and say, here's all the connections in our environment that are incredibly risky and all the other devices they talk to. Can we cut these down to their own segments so that they're not risking everything across the board? And then we can also take a look at things like east-west segmentation, meaning they can't talk across the hospital, north-south, meaning they're not talking to things outside the hospitals they shouldn't, and then vendor access as well. So when GE is reaching in and talking to your devices, that's secure. But in this case, you can go in, you can see there's 74 different actions that can take place, but there's several thousand different devices this would actually impact. So, for example, this top one here, if you apply one set of east-west segmentation rules, it will address 157 different medicine dispensers. With just a couple rules, a couple tests, you will have secured those from attacks that would then replicate throughout an environment. If we wanted to see that, we can drill in. We can see more details. It will take you to the BD site, the specific issues that BD has identified and has pushed out to their customers. It'll take you to a related Microsoft advisory. So these are Microsoft-related issues we want to protect against. It'll talk about several other hacks, and it will give you additional resources. That's all great, but it still requires a security team to understand that and create the policy. We create those policies for you as well. So you could go in, you could edit the policy, and these are the rules that we would actually start to push. And again, I'm so sorry it's blurry. Trust me, they're there. These are the rules that you would then push to your firewalls, push to your NAC, whatever the system is, and you would quickly micro-segment those devices into similar segments, giving protection. So again, you don't need to follow all of that, but when talking to IT teams with network teams, this is how you get really quick wins for your devices. Questions about that one?
You talk about pushing out, you talk about fixes on the machine device itself or on the network?
It depends on the scenario. So you can't always fix things on devices. A lot of them aren't fixable. And the reason being, for example, 40% of devices have operating systems that can't be patched because they're just end of life. So ideally, we remediate everything, we fix everything. In reality, everything is not fixable. Either you have to get rid of that device or you have to find a way to mitigate the issues. This is talking about putting mitigations in place that put the likelihood of attack as close to zero as possible.
Right. Or when you push out, are you pushing out anything beyond what the manufacturer wants?
Segmenting the networks has nothing to do with the manufacturer's authorized, right? You're just
talking about patches, Microsoft patches and that sort of thing.
We want you to work with the vendors, right? So we're not saying go ahead and put a patch in place without working with the vendor here. But next time you have a vendor, you have all the information at your fingertips to say, hey, we need to apply these patches. How do we do it? The rules I'm pointing to right here, these are all network level rules in this case, where you wouldn't have to alter the device in any way. You would actually just alter the network. Make sense? Cool, good question. All right, we're gonna get back to the world of Biomed now. The next one I had was, what was it? Recall research. All right, this is a quick one. I'm gonna go back here, go back to my device list. Recalls are kind of a big deal, right? You wanna make sure that you have all recall notifications. They can get lost sometimes. Because we're sitting there, because we're looking at all that traffic, because we're identifying the different versions of the devices, we can go back to our database and work with the vendors themselves to identify all the recalls. So when you're getting recall notifications, we are as well, and we're adding it to our system to track. So if I go in here, I look at the risks again. I filter by risk group. And instead of looking for default passwords at this point, I can see how many device recalls I have. And in this case, it's 1,279 device recalls, over 1,000. Most of these are IV pumps. I don't think that's a huge surprise to anyone. IV pumps are particularly susceptible for a variety of reasons. But this means next time you're talking to the Altair folks, you can go in and say, hey, we have to go ahead and patch these, or again, micro-segment them out. But think about the difference between a couple of clicks here and actually going through and doing a full inventory of the devices you have. Not only will this tell you all the devices you have, it will also tell you roughly where they are in the hospital, so you can physically start to identify them. The final thing I want to show is attack, defense, and response. So what we want to do here is identify if there are any ongoing attacks within the hospital. And of course, in a demo environment, there are going to be. So in this case, we have 4 different cases. A little bit of background before ADR, before we dive right into this. ADR actually came from our experience with a customer. We were demoing the rest of the system that you've already seen, and we started to notice there was some malware in their environment. We were starting to see indicators, the network was slowing down, things like that. We identified the malware. We told them, hey, you have this issue, how do we fix it? They said, don't worry, we have a service contract. The service contract covers it, it won't be a problem. 3 days later, they came back, said, service contract doesn't cover it. For 6 figures, it will. We don't have 6 figures. Can you help us? So we went through, we did this whole engagement. We identified the malware. We isolated it. We made sure it didn't jump around, and eventually found a way to get rid of it on the, I think it was 3 devices at the time. When we came out of that, we said, oh, this isn't just a one-time engagement. This is actually a really cool thing that we might be able to make into a product. And this is the result of that, right? This is us going back and saying, we took these steps, we identified these. How can we add more identifiers to the process to see what happens when this happens, what we can do? And so we call it ADR. And so in this case, we can see there's 3 or 4 different issues in the environment. In this case, we have an MRI machine. It's contacting a host called malware.wicker.org in Russia, which sounds particularly evil, actually a real host, by the way. We also have its internet browsing to that site. It gives us a specific IP we can look at. If we want to drill down to this, we can just click on it. Again, we see all the information about the machine. We see the IP address, when it was last used, when it was last online, when we first saw it. And we can see all the traffic. So this is one of those things where we see an MRI. We can't replace an MRI tomorrow. We can't just rip it out. We can't just replace it. We have to find some way to keep it functional without risking the rest of the environment. So this is where we would not only say, let's work with your team, let's bring our team in, let's figure out, 1, how we get the issue off this device, but 2, how we also make sure that that issue doesn't bounce beyond other devices. And that can be something as simple as, okay, we've saved the other devices and kept this functional. That's kind of the initial goal. But we've seen cases where this actually improves network traffic, because one thing malware often does is it tries to replicate and it hammers your network. And something as simple as isolating this device will improve the whole network flow across the environment. So we would work with your team to look at this. We can see all the connections that this device is making. So we can actually see that this is connecting to 8 or 10 different devices, other MRI machines. There's a PC that has access to it. So we can put flags on those machines, put them in their own segment, and make sure that everything doesn't replicate beyond that. And then finally, we can look at the forensics of this device as well. There we go. And we can go right down to all the packets that we see going back and forth. Again, we're stripping out all the EPHI and all that sensitive information that you don't want outside your walls, but we can see all the critical metadata there that's important identifying this. So ultimately, as we launch ADR, have launched ADR, this is where we're seeing a lot of customers say that's the big bang for the buck. That's where we need help right now to make sure there's nothing running in our environment as we identify where Biomed devices need to be patched, need to be updated, need to be segmented out, working with the network, Biomed teams, IT, and executive team. Any questions about that? Cool. So to wrap up, make this a little bigger. There's a few things that you can do, not today, tomorrow, whenever you go back to work. One is start asking, how are the IT network security and Biomed teams addressing IoT security? And you may get the answer that, hey, don't worry, we're securing everything. So ask them specifically, where are there gaps between IT and IoT practices, right? Where are you taking all those IT things and making sure that the Biomed devices are getting the same protections? And while this first question may just kind of get a brush off, this second question might actually get some people thinking, because they may not even realize that there is a gap between IT and IoT devices in how you secure them. And that's what we want people to realize, is there have to be extra steps for all these devices you're working with. You also have to ask what compliance requirements need action, right? Does HIPAA compel you to report breaches or action or anything like that? We presented this over, where were we? England recently. And they had brand new compliance requirements that required plans specifically around Biomed and IoT devices and how to secure them. So start to investigate how compliance requirements may play into this as well. The other thing you can start doing is asking the executive team in particular, and a little bit the IT team, how they're going to respond in the event of an attack. Right? We're not trying to scare people with ransomware. It's just unfortunate that ransomware exists. And it's not a matter of if, but when people are going to be attacked and to what degree. So ask them, if there's an attack, who are you going to call? And what are the immediate actions that are going to be taken? We've been in meetings, and I shouldn't laugh about it, but we've been in meetings where someone picks up their phone, face goes white, and they literally run out of the room. They don't say, excuse me, sorry, I got to go. They literally run out of the room. We find out months later, they were going around unplugging machines because there was an active attack that they were finding, and they wanted to limit the attack surface as much as possible, and just physically ripping plugs out of the wall was the way to do that, whether it be a Cat5 cable or the actual plug itself. So ask the team, what's going to happen if we see an active ransomware attack? How are we going to protect the hospital? Some places have outstanding action plans, Some are just kind of hoping right now. Also ask, and this is, you know, maybe Biomed people don't ask this, but ask your bosses to ask their bosses. From the healthcare standpoint, or from the financial standpoint, excuse me, how much downtime can they reasonably handle? And how much cyber security insurance will cover that? This is more of an executive discussion. We see some executives are incredibly aware of this, but others just have no idea what cybersecurity insurance will actually cover or what the real cost of these breaches is. And then finally, you can always contact us if you want to learn more about this, if you want a deeper demo. If this isn't the right system for you, but maybe some of your colleagues and peers, let us know. We'd be happy to educate them, talk to them. Even if you just want more information or you're having a specific challenge around how to work with IT and security teams, let us know. We'd be happy to talk it through with you. Questions?